The last light of the day was bleeding across the horizon when Clara staggered into the clearing. The plain stretched endless behind her, bruised with violet dusk, the wind sharp with winter's teeth. Her shawl clung ragged to her shoulders, more thread than warmth, and beneath it the faint stirring of her child kept her moving, though her own body ached for rest. The baby whimpered against her chest, small mouth seeking what she could no longer give. Hunger had hollowed them both. Ahead, the ranch stood solitary, its timbers dark against the snow-patched ground, smoke rising thin from a chimney that promised heat. Fence posts marked the land in rigid lines, and cattle huddled near the barn, their breath ghosting in the cold air. She had heard of Elias Hardin, heard whispers in town of his silence, his distance, a man carved out of stone and years of solitude. He was the kind who answered less than he saw, who endured without asking for company. When she reached the porch, her legs nearly gave way. She lifted her face, chapped lips parted, and knocked once, soft but urgent. The door opened to reveal him, tall, broad in the shoulders, hair streaked with early grey, eyes deep-set and unreadable. The firelight from within caught on the lines of his face, and for a moment Clara could not speak. Then desperation broke her silence. "Take him," she whispered, voice ragged. "I have nothing left. Bread, anything." She pressed the child forward, tears stinging though she tried to hold them back. Her words felt like knives turned inward. No mother should beg so. Yet hunger had stripped her down to bone and pleading. Elias did not answer. His gaze travelled from her face to the bundle at her chest, to the trembling of her hands. The wind cut between them, carrying the creak of the barn and the distant cry of a crow. Clara thought he might shut the door, leave her to the cold. Shame burned hot in her throat. But instead, without a word, he stepped back and let her inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather. Heat from the fire wrapped around her, though the silence that followed seemed colder than the prairie outside. She sank into a chair near the hearth, clutching her child, and for a moment the warmth itself was overwhelming, as though she had trespassed into another life. Elias moved with slow purpose, fetching a tin pail of milk, pouring some into a shallow cup. He dipped a cloth and held it near the baby's lips until the child suckled weakly, eyes fluttering with new strength. Clara watched, numb. She did not know if she had given her child away or if she had been allowed to keep him under another man's roof. Every gesture of Elias was deliberate but spare, as if he rationed not only food but also words. When the baby settled into sleep, Clara pulled her shawl tighter, heart raw with shame and relief twisted together. She dared a glance at Elias. He had returned to the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, face lit by firelight and shadow. His eyes were distant, unreadable, as though her presence had disturbed not just his evening but some long-held solitude. The crackle of burning logs filled the room. Clara's breath steadied, but her thoughts did not. She knew survival had come at a cost she had not yet measured. Whether she had found shelter or another form of judgment, she could not tell. Outside, the prairie stretched endless beneath a sky of iron clouds. Inside, the fire warmed her skin while silence weighed on her soul. Elias Hardin had taken both her and the child, but whether he had saved them or merely claimed them, the night gave no answer. The days unfolded slow and uncertain, like snow drifting down from a sky without sun. Clara rose each morning with the baby stirring, the air in the cabin cool before the fire caught again. She filled her hands with work, not from command but from instinct, as though labor might anchor her in this place. She scrubbed the wooden floor with cloth and water drawn from the pump, mended the shirts Elias left folded on a bench, and rocked her child in the creaking chair until his breathing steadied. Elias spoke little, his presence a steady weight at the edges of the room. He split logs with methodical rhythm, carried water, tended to cattle, and returned without fanfare. Sometimes his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, measuring, perhaps, or remembering. The silence between them thickened like smoke, filling spaces where words might have eased her doubts. She did not know if she lived here as a guest or endured here as something less. When she closed her eyes at night, memories surged unbidden. Her husband's face, dirt-streaked, twisted with pain beneath the wagon that crushed him. The crowd that gathered, not to help, but to watch. Later, the same townsfolk who turned away when she asked for work, their faces stiff with pity or disdain. "Nothing worth keeping," one voice had hissed in her memory, words that clung like burrs to her skin. In the cradle of Elias' cabin, the echoes of abandonment whispered as loudly as the winter wind. Yet Elias, too, seemed tethered to shadows. She noticed the way he placed a chair near the door each night, rifle leaned against it, as though expecting footsteps in the dark. Once, when she ventured beyond the main room, she found a box tucked away. Inside lay a woman's photograph, faded at the edges, and beside it a long braid tied with ribbon, hair cut and kept like a relic. Folded beneath was a wedding dress, its fabric yellowed with time, laid down not in storage but in mourning. Clara did not touch it, but the sight pressed heavy on her heart. The house, for all its warmth, felt bound by ghosts. Her grief and his loss circled one another like wary animals. They did not speak of it, yet each could sense the other's scars, raw though hidden. At times, when the baby's cry pierced the night and Elias stirred from his chair, she glimpsed something in his eyes, a flicker of pain, recognition, or perhaps envy for what had been taken from him long ago. The silence remained, but Clara began to hear it differently. Not emptiness, not cruelty, but survival, the way a man walls himself off when words have no power to heal. It was the same reason she worked without being asked, why she kept her back straight though hunger had once bent her low. They were both survivors, walking among ruins, learning, slowly, painfully, what it meant to remain when others had gone. The fire burned low, the shadows long across the wooden floor. Clara held her child close, feeling the soft warmth of life against her chest, and across the room Elias sat in his chair by the door, rifle at his side. Two broken lives, under one roof, watched the flames as if they might spell out some answer in their crackling light. Neither spoke, but in the quiet, they both knew they were not alone in their haunted keeping. The plains, rattling shutters and bending the bare trees until their branches groaned. By dusk, snow followed in blinding sheets, the kind that erased horizon from sky, land from air. The cabin shuddered beneath each gust, timbers creaking as if they too felt the weight of the storm. Inside, the fire flared bright, throwing warmth against the bitter draught, though the sound of the wind pressed against the walls like 100 fists. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around herself and the child, who whimpered at the sudden howl that slipped through the cracks. Elias sat near the door, rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames as though waiting out something older than weather. Then came the knock. Sharp, deliberate, carrying above the wind's roar. Clara's breath caught. The baby stirred and fussed. Elias rose, slow but certain, and unlatched the door, opening it against the fury of snow. A man stood there, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, hat pulled low, face red from the cold. His smile was the kind that cut. "Well now," the stranger drawled, brushing snow from his shoulders. His eyes slid past Elias and found Clara in the corner. Recognition lit them with cruel amusement. "Didn't think I'd see you again. Begging for scraps back in town wasn't enough. Thought you'd sell yourself off to keep that brat fed." The words struck harder than the storm outside. Clara's cheeks burned, shame pressing her down in the chair. She clutched her child as though to shield him from the venom in the man's tone. Every syllable dragged her back to nights of hunger, to eyes that looked on her with scorn instead of mercy. Elias said nothing. The storm was in his jaw, the tightening of his hand on the rifle stock. For a moment, Clara thought he might strike, drive the man into the snow with force. But instead, he stepped forward, filling the doorway, his silence heavier than any threat. With one shove, he closed the door against the trader, the latch snapping into place. The wind swallowed the man's laughter until only the blizzard remained. The fire crackled, but Clara could not warm herself. Her hands shook around the baby, her ears echoing with the stranger's cruel words. She did not dare look at Elias, afraid she would find agreement in his eyes, or worse, indifference. The night dragged on with the storm's howl. Shadows bent and swayed across the walls. Clara lay awake on the pallet Elias had given her, the baby nestled close, and trembled at the thought that no matter how far she had come, shame still followed. She wondered if Elias thought less of her now, if his silence meant judgment. Morning came pale and grey, snow piled deep against the cabin walls, the world outside buried and blank. Clara stirred to the scent of something rich and savoury. On the table by the hearth, steam rose from a bowl of stew Elias had set out. He did not speak, did not meet her eyes, only returned to mending a harness by the window. Clara sat, spoon in hand, the warmth of the food spreading into her chest, thawing what the trader's cruelty had frozen. His silence was different now, not a void, not a weapon, but a wall. A barrier against men who would see her broken. A shelter, even if it was one that kept her at a distance. Outside, the snow erased every track, every trace of the stranger's boots. The prairie lay clean beneath its white shroud, and for the first time in many months, Clara let herself breathe as though the past might remain buried, at least for a while. Snow pressed heavy against the windows, sealing them in as though the world beyond had ceased to exist. Days bled into nights, each measured by the crackle of firewood and the steady rhythm of survival. Elias moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, shaping wood with his tools, mending harness leather, sharpening blades. Clara bent over her sewing, patching worn fabric with thread she unraveled from her own garments. Between them, the baby lay swaddled, drifting in and out of sleep, the rise and fall of his breath the softest sound in the room. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the hiss of the kettle when it boiled, the creak of the rocking chair as Clara soothed her child, the slow drip of melting snow from boots lined up by the hearth. Each sound became magnified in the absence of words, their lives narrowed to gestures and the tasks of staying warm, staying fed, staying alive. Yet beneath the rhythm, tension lived, like a taut rope stretched between two poles, each moment pulling, testing its strength. One evening, as the fire dwindled to embers, Clara gathered the courage that had been pressing against her chest for days. Her voice was small, but it broke through the hush. "Why did you take us in?" The question hung in the air, fragile, dangerous. Elias did not look at her. His hand moved across the rifle he was oiling, slow and deliberate, as though the silence might swallow the question whole. For a long moment, she feared he would let it die unanswered. At last, he spoke, his voice low and measured, a stone dropping into still water. "Because no one else would." The words cut, yet not cruelly. They were not born of pity or affection, but of something sterner, heavier, justice, perhaps, or simple truth. Clara bowed her head, staring into the cradle where her child slept. It was not the kindness she had secretly longed for, yet the honesty in it softened something inside her, eased the tightness she had carried since the day she crossed his threshold. Later, as she folded the baby's blanket, she caught sight of Elias at the table. In his rough hands lay a pocket-knife, her husband's, the one she had nearly sold in town before hunger drove her here. She had left it tucked away, too heavy with memory to use. Elias turned it over, tested the edge against his thumb, then set to work sharpening the blade. His movements were careful, deliberate, restoring life to steel dulled by time. Clara watched from the shadows, her throat tight, as though the act had returned not just an object but a piece of her dignity she had thought forever lost. The snowstorm roared outside, but within the cabin a different storm ebbed. The silence shifted, no longer a void but a language of its own, one built from gestures, from the steady repair of broken things, from the simple truth of two souls surviving in the same space. Clara understood then that Elias bore his own wounds, his own ghosts that kept him watchful and withdrawn. As she settled into the rocking chair, baby pressed against her chest, the creak of the wood filled the room with rhythm. Elias did not look up from the knife, yet something unseen had passed between them. Survival shared beneath one roof was changing them both, slowly, like thaw beneath snow. Neither spoke it, but both felt the weight and the mercy of it in the silence they kept. The thaw came slowly, the white fields softening to brown, rivulets of water running through the ruts of the land. Birds returned in hesitant song, and the air, though still sharp, carried the scent of earth instead of snow. Clara felt the change in her bones, the way the cabin no longer seemed to press so tightly against her chest. The baby gurgled with new strength, cheeks fuller, eyes brighter, as though the season itself had chosen to spare him. For a while, hope seemed to stir like shoots beneath the frost. It was on such a morning that the riders came. Their silhouettes appeared first on the horizon, black shapes against the pale sky, moving with purpose. Clara saw them from the porch, the baby in her arms, and something inside her knew before the words were spoken. They reined in before the cabin, boots splashing through meltwater, faces hard with contempt. "Clara," one called, his voice coarse. "You've debts unpaid. Thought you could vanish into a rancher's walls. Thought silence could erase what's owed." His gaze slid past her to Elias, who stood near the barn, shoulders squared. "And you, sheltering beggars now." Another spat in the mud, his sneer curling. "She's nothing. Always was." The words sank like stones into her chest. Shame rose again, bitter and familiar. She had known this day would come, when judgment would find her no matter how deeply buried she thought herself. With trembling hands, she set the baby back in his cradle just inside the door. Then she stepped forward, shoulders straight though her heart quailed. "I'll go," she said, voice steady. "Only leave the child." But Elias moved before she could take another step. He came to stand in front of her, rifle raised with calm authority. His silence held more than words ever could. It held warning, strength, and a promise that no one would take from him what he had chosen to keep. The riders shifted uneasily, seeing the steel in his eyes, the unflinching steadiness of his grip. No boast, no threat, only certainty. The air thickened, the horses stamping in restless unease, until at last the men turned their reins and rode off, their insults scattered to the wind. When the dust had settled, Clara stood frozen. The tears came not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of having been defended, when all her life she had been left to defend herself alone. Her knees nearly buckled with it, and she pressed her hands to her face, the sobs breaking free in the privacy of the cabin's shadow. That night, the firelight danced long across the walls, casting the room in gold and shadow. Elias sat near the hearth, the rifle now resting against the mantel, his silence undisturbed. Clara nursed the baby, tears dried, but her heart still raw from the day. She felt a shift inside her, a loosening of the chain that bound her worth to others' scorn. When the child finally slept, Elias rose and placed his hand upon the cradle. His palm was rough, scarred, the skin worn by work and weather. Yet the gesture was steady, reverent, as though he blessed the child's sleep with the strength he himself carried. Clara watched, her breath catching. His silence, once sharp and unyielding, no longer felt like absence. It was belonging, firm and quiet, like the ground beneath their feet. She saw then that he lived not only with ghosts but with a heart still capable of guarding what remained. And Elias, though he did not speak, seemed to know that memory alone could not keep a man alive. In that small room, beneath the hum of fire and the creak of the rocking chair, something unseen took root between them, a bond beginning to burn, fragile yet certain, like kindling waiting for flame. Word of what had happened spread quick through the town, carried on voices that delighted in turning survival into scandal. They spoke of Clara, the beggar widow, who had hidden herself in Hardin's house, and of the rancher who dared defy the riders who came to claim her. Men laughed in saloons, women whispered along the boardwalk, and before long Elias heard the echoes of it himself. He said little, but the set of his jaw grew tighter each day. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills one evening, he had saddled his horse, rifle bound to the leather, determination carved deep into the lines of his face. Clara watched him from the doorway, her child pressed to her chest. Fear trembled in her voice as she begged him not to go. "Please, Elias. They've taken enough. Don't let them take you too." But he only met her eyes for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he turned and swung into the saddle, the hoofbits fading down the road like a drumbeat of inevitability. The confrontation was not drawn into spectacle. The men who had spat on Clara gathered in the street, rifles near at hand, their words barbed with contempt. Elias faced them without boasting, his silence sharper than insult, his rifle steady in his grip. For a breathless instant, death hovered there in the dust. A shot cracked, not into flesh, but into the ground, scattering grit into the air. The sound tore through the standoff, breaking it without blood. The men faltered beneath the weight of his gaze, then melted back into their shadows, their scorn silenced. Elias rode home under a sky streaked with the last of daylight, his body bearing the ache of strain though no bullet had found him. He carried nothing back but the quiet triumph of a man who had stood, not for pride, but for justice. On the porch, Clara waited. She rose as his horse approached, the baby swaddled in her arms. When he dismounted, she stepped forward and placed the child into his arms, not as she had on that first desperate night, but freely, as a gift of trust. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time, his silence broke in full. "You're home now," he said. The words fell soft but deep, as though they had been waiting years to find breath. Clara's heart trembled, not with fear, but with something warmer, something she had thought gone forever. The rains of spring came, washing the land clean. In the evenings, Clara sat in the rocking chair, shawl drawn around her shoulders, the baby suckling at her breast, the fire glowing steady in the hearth. Through the window, she could see Elias in the distance, mending fence posts with patient hands, his figure steady against the greening earth. What began as desperation had become endurance, what began as silence had become language. Two broken lives, stitched together not by bargains or pity, but by the slow, stubborn grace of second chances. Where once there had been only abandonment, now there was the quiet endurance of love.